What if everything you were taught about where the Irish came from turned out to be wrong? Scientists ran the most comprehensive DNA comparison ever attempted on the Irish population, testing it against every nation in Europe. And the result shocked even the researchers themselves. It did not point to the Celts. It did not point to the Vikings. It pointed somewhere nobody expected. If this kind of deep, fascinating science grabs your attention, do me a quick favor, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who loves history or ancestry. You will not regret sticking around for this one. Let me take you through this story from the beginning, because it changes everything we think we know about one of the most iconic populations on the planet. The study was centered at Trinity College, Dublin. A team of geneticists led by Professor Dan Bradley at the Smurfit Institute of Genetics set out to do something ambitious. They wanted to construct a detailed genetic map of Ireland. Not a rough sketch, not a small sample. A comprehensive, high-resolution portrait of Irish ancestry built from hundreds of individual DNA samples. They then did something no one had done at this scale before. They compared those samples against existing genetic databases covering populations from across Britain, Scandinavia, Central Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. They tested thousands of genetic markers simultaneously. It's the kind of analysis that leaves no room for guesswork. Now, here is what most people would have predicted. Ireland sits close to Britain. It was invaded by Vikings. It has centuries of cultural ties to the idea of Celtic heritage rooted in Central Europe. So logically, you would expect the closest genetic matches to come from Wales, Scotland, England, or maybe Scandinavia or France. None of those turned out to be the answer. When the data came back, it told a story that defied every conventional assumption. Ireland's closest genetic relatives were not found across the Irish Sea. They were not found in the heart of old Celtic territory. They were found in the Basque country of northern Spain, and in Galicia, the windswept corner of the Iberian Peninsula that juts out into the Atlantic. This was not some vague, borderline statistical signal. This was a powerful, unmistakable genetic connection. Published in the journal Nature, the findings revealed that a set of ancient genetic markers known as haplogroup R1b were present in over 98% of men tested in Connaught, the westernmost province of Ireland. That is the highest concentration found anywhere on Earth. Now, think about that for a moment. Across all of Europe, through all the migrations, invasions, and population shuffles of the last 10,000 years, this particular genetic marker had been diluted almost everywhere. In France, it sat around 50%. In northern Italy, roughly 33%. In Turkey, barely 2%. But in the Basque country, it climbed back up to 89%. Two groups of people living on opposite ends of Western Europe, separated by ocean and mountain, and yet carrying the same ancient genetic fingerprint and concentrations that dwarfed every other population on the continent. The obvious question is how? How did this happen? How could the Irish and the Basques end up so closely matched when there are? The obvious question is how? How did this happen? How could the Irish and the Basques end up so closely matched when there are entire nations sitting between them geographically? The answer does not lie in recent history. It does not lie in medieval trade routes or colonial movements. It lies in the Ice Age. About 25,000 years ago, Europe entered a period called the last glacial maximum. Massive sheets of ice blanketed the continent. Scandinavia was buried. Britain was frozen. Central Europe was largely uninhabitable. The human populations living in those areas had no choice. They fled south, retreating to the only places warm enough to survive. These places are called glacial refugia, small pockets of habitable land along the southern edges of Europe where people could hold on and wait for the cold to pass. One of the most important of these refugia was a narrow strip of territory along the coast of what is now northern Spain and southwestern France. This area, known as the Franco-Cantabrian region, became densely populated with hunter-gatherer communities. The Basque people are considered the most direct living descendants of those Ice Age survivors. Their ancestry traces back 20,000 years to the communities that were sheltered in those coastal mountains while the rest of Europe lay frozen and empty. Then, around 15,000 years ago, the ice began to pull back. Slowly, the frozen landscapes of Europe opened up again, and the people who had survived in those southern refugia began to spread outward, recolonizing the empty continent. Some moved north through France and into Central Europe. Others took a different path. They moved along the Atlantic coastline, following the edge of the ocean northward. Some of them reached the shores of Ireland. Think about that journey. People who had ice began to pull back. Slowly, the frozen landscapes of Europe opened up again, and the people who had survived in those southern refugia began to spread outward, recolonizing the empty continent. Some moved north through France and into Central Europe. Others took a different path. They moved along the Atlantic coastline, following the edge of the ocean northward. Some of them reached the shores of Ireland. Think about that journey. People who had survived the worst climate catastrophe in human memory, clinging to rocky coastlines in northern Spain for thousands of years, finally setting out when the world warmed and making their way to an island at the very edge of the known world. And once they arrived, something remarkable happened. Geography became their protector. Ireland sits at the extreme western fringe of Europe. The Atlantic Ocean wraps around it like a wall. For the next several thousand years, as waves of new populations swept across the European continent, those waves lost momentum before they ever reached Ireland's shores. Every major migration that reshaped the genetics of mainland Europe arrived at Ireland's coast weaker, smaller, and less transformative than it had been at its origin. Professor Bradley described this phenomenon in vivid terms. The great tides of human populations that swept back and forth across Europe did not lap onto the shores of Ireland so much because it was out on the edge. And within Ireland, the effect was most extreme in the west. Connaught, surrounded by ocean on three sides, absorbed less outside genetic influence than any other part of the island. The ancient DNA carried there by those post-Ice Age settlers from Iberia survived in its purest, most concentrated form, over 98%, the highest in the world. Now here is where the story gets even more interesting. Inside the Basque country itself, there are several subregions. When researchers ran multidimensional genetic analysis comparing Irish populations to each of these Basque groups, the closest match was not with the Western Basque provinces. It was with Guipuzcoa, the most geographically eastern of the Basque populations. Guipuzcoa was found to be genetically closer to Ireland than to any of the other Basque subregions, closer than France, closer than Wales, closer than the rest of Spain. A single province tucked into the mountains of northern Iberia was more genetically similar to people living on the western coast of Ireland than it was to its own immediate neighbors. That finding alone should rewrite textbooks. The specific genetic marker at the heart of this connection, haplogroup R1b, is the most common Y chromosome. Haplogroup in Western Europe, it reaches its highest frequencies along the Atlantic fringe, Ireland, the Scottish Highlands, Western Wales, the Atlantic coast of France, and the Basque country. Within this broader group, a particular variant called the Atlantic modal haplotype appears at especially high frequencies in these populations. It consists of 6 specific genetic markers found in people stretching from the Orkney Islands to the Basque coast. This is not a coincidence. This is a genetic memory of a shared migration route. The Atlantic edge of Europe carries within it a living record of the people who recolonized the continent after the ice retreated. And at the two extreme ends of that edge, in Ireland and in the Basque country, that record was preserved better than anywhere else. If you are still watching, you clearly appreciate deep, well-researched content. So here is what I need from you. Drop a comment below telling me where your ancestors came from. Then hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a video like this. Your engagement is what keeps this channel alive, and I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Now, let me take you even deeper. In 2015, a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences changed the game entirely. Researchers from Trinity College Dublin did something that had never been done before. They sequenced the complete genomes of prehistoric Irish individuals. Not fragments, not estimates. Full genomes extracted from ancient bones. The team analyzed 4 individuals. The first was a Neolithic woman who lived between approximately 3343 and 3020 BC. Her remains were found in a tomb at Ballinahady, near Belfast. The other 3 were Bronze Age men dated between 2026 and 1534 BC, buried on Rathlin Island off the coast of Northern Ireland. What those ancient genomes revealed was extraordinary. The Neolithic woman carried a genome that was predominantly of Near Eastern origin. This confirmed that a major wave of early farming populations had migrated from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, across Europe and into Ireland around 9,000 years ago. These were the people who brought agriculture to the island. They built the great megalithic tombs that still dot the Irish landscape. Newgrange, Carrowmore, the mysterious dolmens perched on western hillsides. The 3 Bronze Age men told a different story. Their genomes showed substantial genetic heritage from the Eurasian steppe. This meant that the massive population movements of the 3rd millennium BC, originating from the grasslands of modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, had traveled all the way across Europe and reached Ireland. These steppe herders brought with them metallurgy, new cultural practices, and possibly something even more significant: language. Their arrival opened the possibility that the earliest forms of Celtic speech came to Ireland not with Iron Age warriors from Central Europe, but with Bronze Age pastoralists from the Eastern steppe. But here is what made the Irish case truly remarkable. Despite both of these major waves, something older survived underneath: the ancient Atlantic layer. the genetic foundation laid by those Ice Age survivors who had traveled up from Iberia thousands of years before the farmers or the herders ever arrived. The Bronze Age genomes showed their strongest similarities to modern Irish, Scottish, and Welsh populations, and several genetic variants that today reach their maximum global frequencies in Ireland were already present at this early horizon. Variants linked to lactase persistence, which allows adults to digest milk. Variants for blue eye color, the RMB Y chromosome haplogroup, even the gene for hereditary hemochromatosis, a condition sometimes called the Celtic disease. Ireland sits at the end of many European genetic gradients. It holds world record frequencies for several of these ancient variants. The bones confirmed what the living population data had already hinted at. Ireland's genome was assembled early and preserved for an extraordinarily long time. But the story does not end with the Bronze Age. Ireland may have been sheltered by geography, but it was never completely sealed off. History eventually found its way to the island, carried on the prows of Viking longships. The Norse arrived in the late 8th century, first as raiders, burning monasteries and carrying off treasures, then as settlers, building fortified harbors along the eastern and southern coasts. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork. All of these cities began as Viking settlements, and the Vikings left their genetic mark. The Irish DNA Atlas study, published in 2017 in the journal Scientific Reports, detected clear evidence of Norse genetic flow into the Irish population. But the signal was concentrated along the eastern seaboard. In the interior and the west, it was faint or absent. Ireland absorbed the Vikings. It did not become them. The Normans arrived next in 1169. Mounted knights with feudal ambitions crossed from Wales and carved out territories across the island. They too left genetic traces, particularly in the east and northeast. Then came the most interior and the west. It was faint or absent. Ireland absorbed the Vikings. It did not become them. The Normans arrived next in 1169. Mounted knights with feudal ambitions crossed from Wales and carved out territories across the island. They too left genetic traces, particularly in the east and northeast. Then came the most genetically disruptive event in Irish history, the Ulster plantations of the 17th century. Thousands of Scottish and English settlers were transplanted into the northern province, creating an entirely new demographic reality. The Irish DNA Atlas revealed a sharp genetic boundary cutting across Northern Ireland. Ulster stood apart from the rest of the island, a high contrast line reflecting centuries of deliberate population engineering, and yet, through all of it, the deep western core held firm. Connaught, the province that faces the rest of the island, a high contrast line reflecting centuries of deliberate population engineering, and yet, through all of it, the deep western core held firm. Connaught, the province that faces the open Atlantic, the land of stone walls and wild coastline. It absorbed less outside influence than any other part of Ireland. The ancient genetic signature that arrived from Iberia after the Ice Age survived there in its most concentrated, most undiluted form. The layers of conquest piled up on the eastern and northern edges. But the oldest Ireland, the genetic Ireland, survived on the coast that looks west toward America and, genetically speaking, south toward Spain. Now, I want to talk about something that makes this connection between Ireland and the Basque country even more haunting. Language. The Basque language is unique on this planet. It is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It is not part of the Indo-European family that includes Irish, English, French, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, and almost every other language spoken from Western Europe to South Asia. Basque stands entirely alone. Scientists believe that Basque may be the last surviving remnant of the languages that were spoken across Western Europe before the arrival of Indo-European tongues. Before the steppe migrations swept across the continent 4,000 years ago, bringing with them the linguistic ancestors of Celtic, Germanic, and Romance languages, the people of Atlantic Europe spoke something else, something older, something that may have been related to what the Basques still speak today. If that is true, then the people who migrated from Iberia to Ireland after the Ice Age may have carried with them languages from that same ancient family, languages that were eventually replaced when the Bronze Age steppe migrants arrived and brought the earliest forms of Celtic speech. Ireland kept the genes but lost the older language. The Basque country, more isolated and more fiercely resistant to outside influence, managed to keep both. Professor James Mallory of Queen's University Belfast captured this paradox perfectly. When an existing population with its own language is taken over by newcomers, the old language often disappears, but the old genes remain. They dilute the genetic contribution of the invaders, not the other way. To outside influence, managed to keep both. Professor James Mallory of Queen's University Belfast captured this paradox perfectly. When an existing population with its own language is taken over by newcomers, the old language often disappears, but the old genes remain. They dilute the genetic contribution of the invaders, not the other way around. This is exactly what happened in Ireland. The Celtic language arrived. It took root, it flourished, but the people who adopted it were not themselves Celtic in origin. They were something far older. They were the descendants of Ice Age survivors from the Atlantic coast of Iberia. The people came before the language. The language changed. The bloodline did not. Before we reach the final chapter of this story, I want to ask you something personal. Has this video changed the way you think about ancestry or identity? If it has, share it right now with someone you think would find it fascinating. Send it to a friend, post it on social media. Every share helps this kind of deep, meaningful content reach more people who deserve to see it. Now, let me bring this all together. The 2017 Irish DNA Atlas study divided the Irish population into 10 genetically distinct clusters, each tied to specific geographic regions. 7 of those clusters traced their ancestry to ancient Gaelic Irish roots. 3 reflected shared Irish-British heritage, shaped by later historical events. Those 7 Gaelic clusters are the genetic echo of the original Atlantic settlers, the Ice Age survivors who made landfall on Ireland's western coast and whose descendants spread across the island over thousands of years. Every layer of Irish history added something. The Neolithic farmers from the Near East brought agriculture and monument building. The Bronze Age steppe herders brought metal, language, and new ways of life. The Vikings brought trade and urban settlement. The Normans brought feudalism. The plantations brought demographic upheaval. But underneath all of those layers, like bedrock beneath soil, lies the oldest genetic foundation, a foundation shared with the Basque people of northern Spain, laid down more than 10,000 years ago by a population that walked out of the Ice Age and followed the Atlantic coast to the edge of the world. When scientists set out to compare Irish DNA against every European nation, they were not searching for a dramatic revelation. They were following data, running comparisons, checking numbers. What those numbers revealed was a connection so ancient and so profound that it forces us to rethink the entire origin story of the Irish people. The Irish are not, in their deepest genetic essence, children of the Celts. They are not primarily Viking or Norman or British. In their most ancient layer, they are children of Iberia, descendants of a people who survived the worst cold the planet has seen in 100,000 years, who sheltered on a narrow strip of Spanish coastline, and who, when the world finally warmed, sent their descendants north, along the ocean's edge to find an island where their genes would endure longer than anywhere else on Earth. The DNA carried that story in silence for 10,000 years. No historian recorded it, no myth fully captured it, no textbook predicted it. But the science finally learned how to listen. And what it heard was astonishing. At the deepest level of their ancestry, the Irish and the Basques are the same ancient people, separated by geography, united by blood, connected by a journey that began in the shadow of glaciers and ended on the rain-swept shores of the Atlantic's final island. That is the true origin of the Irish, not written in books, written in bones and blood and the quiet, patient memory of DNA.